Hi, my name is Ananya Ramesh, and my topic is on the importance of holistic and inclusive high school and U.S. history classes. Do you know who Claudette Colvin was? James MacDonald? Shirley Chisholm? I didn't know either. One was the first Indigenous lawyer and fought for the rights of Indigenous people, and one was the first Black woman to be a presidential candidate for a major party. One was actually the predecessor and inspiration for the demonstration that Rosa Parks famously led. They were all extremely influential and left a lasting impact on history. But why have most high schoolers in the United States never heard of them? According to the Pew Research Center, 48% of high school students in the United States are minorities. With such a large minority population, it would make sense to be inclusive of these groups when teaching about history. However, this is not always the case, as many equate inclusivity to anti-patriotism. But ignoring diversity in history can have profound effects. If teaching the history of different cultures is so beneficial, it just makes sense to implement these changes for the betterment of high school students. High school students should learn American history through a lens that is inclusive of historically marginalized groups and uncomfortable topics. To do this, they should be exposed to and should compare primary sources from a variety of backgrounds to improve their analysis, argumentation, and critical thinking skills. First, I'll go over the groups that have been misrepresented in U.S. history classes, as well as the negative effects that this exclusion has had. Then I'll explain how we can effectively teach inclusive history classes and why this is so beneficial. Lastly, I will provide examples of steps being taken to further the goal of inclusive education, plus how far we still need to go to achieve this goal in high school U.S. history classes. In U.S. history classes, material tends to exclusively touch on the stories of some people, who tend to be white, rather than the stories of Black people, Indigenous people, or other marginalized groups. When the history of minorities is told, it's usually through the lens of the most privileged. For example, NPR reports that until last school year, high schoolers in Texas were taught that the main causes of the Civil War were sectionalism, states' rights, and slavery, in that order. Glossing over the cruel practice of slavery and its role in history is harmful because students will never learn how it impacts today's society. This isn't a singular case. Most American history is taught with bias, even unintentionally. Take a look at this table, where a high school American history textbook was analyzed on 3 different uncomfortable or controversial topics in American history. The textbook does not provide primary documents for any of the 3 topics. And out of the 3, 2 of the 3 topics had stereotypes or biases, and essential information was excluded. This is dangerous because it teaches some communities that they aren't as important or that they're looked down upon. It can be harmful, not only by hurting student morale and achievement, but because by influencing the mindset of these students to believe biases, it sets them up for a future of alienation from each other and a lack of discourse on how to improve the lives of historically marginalized people. Exclusion can have adverse effects in the classroom, from student morale to academic achievement. For example, NPR reported that the textbook Mexican American Heritage is filled with stereotypes about Mexicans being lazy, having the mañana mindset, and bringing crime and drugs to the United States. When students only see people of their race painted in a negative light, they could feel like they aren't valued or are not important to history. If this is the case, why would they pay attention or feel motivated to learn? In another case, Audrey Kim, an Asian American, wrote about her struggles of feeling alienated in classes and losing interest because of it. Many non-white people feel this way when they are never represented or feel connected to their communities in history classes. However, according to a study led by the National Bureau of Economic Research, embracing this diversity and teaching students in an inclusive way leads to increased attendance and higher GPAs. Many educators and leaders propose inquiry lessons that encourage critical thinking by examining different perspectives. There are many benefits to this type of education. The AP US history teacher at Ardrey-Kell, Mrs. Sorbonne, believes that history classes are a safe way to expose students to multiple viewpoints. Examining multiple viewpoints is essential because currently biased media sources and social media sites are a way for individuals and groups to live in an echo chamber and become further polarized. By being able to pull apart information from varied sources in a safe space, such as a history classroom, students can learn to think critically when faced with similar scenarios later in life. Using various primary sources can show how experiences shape opinions, and that history is more complex than the way it is often taught. So, what is being done now to bring about inclusive education? In North Carolina specifically, the Board of Education is changing history classes to include education on racism, discrimination, and identity. However, WRAL reports that the Board of Education is mostly just altering objectives, not changing actual curriculum requirements. Plus, the motion still faces struggles. There's a debate over whether to include the phrases gender identity and systemic racism in class objectives. Plus, many people see it as unpatriotic to critically examine the U.S., including the country's mistakes and shortcomings. There are still more actions educators can take themselves. As said by Zoe Padron, a teacher in Charlottesville, Virginia, we need to reteach teachers by asking them to reflect on their biases. Teachers should encourage comparison and critical thinking in the classroom in order to bring together multiple perspectives of one event. Teachers should facilitate productive discussion about these topics so that students can learn vital discussion skills and learn to critically examine history. In conclusion, exclusionary education that only shows one point of view is harmful because in addition to not teaching students proper analysis skills, it hurts students' achievement, engagement, and interest in history classes. By utilizing a variety of primary sources from different points of view, history can become more inclusive and teach students how to gain a holistic view of history instead of the view of the most privileged. Although gains are being made to make history classes more inclusive, they should become more discussion-based and require critical thinking skills in order to prepare students to use these skills in the future. Hopefully, with these changes, students in high school can feel welcome in their history classes and be ready to write history themselves. Thank you. Why did you choose this topic? So last year when I was taking APUSH, I realized that there were a lot of things about men and America's accomplishments, while it kind of glossed over America's shortcomings and things that we kind of maybe did wrong in history. And it didn't really go in depth in these topics, even though we did cover them. So I think that American history should definitely be more inclusive of different backgrounds and talk about those shortcomings more. And I think that's definitely still relevant today. And what did you learn that surprised you or particularly interested you? So I didn't really go into this as much in my speech, but I thought something that was really surprising was how American exceptionalism, the idea that America is the best country in the world, has made it so that discussing the country's shortcomings is seen as unpatriotic. So a lot of the sources that I was reading about, there were a lot of people who said, well, we can't make this inclusive because then it's unpatriotic and we're not learning about how great America is. And I think that they don't have to be separate. You can still learn about the good things that America has done, because there are a lot of good things, while still talking about America's shortcomings and using them as a learning opportunity so that we don't repeat those mistakes in the future. So I thought that was really interesting because I had never really thought about how the lens in which we learn things can relate to patriotism or more of like the political side of it, and I thought it was surprising that it was so politicized. Okay, how have you grown from this experience, such as researching, writing, preparing a presentation? So I think I learned how to effectively research from multiple resources and kind of pull them together to create one cohesive argument. And also, I learned how to verbally communicate my research because in the past, I'd mostly just written arguments and presented research that way, but being able to put it in a verbal kind of media and really presenting it in that way is different, and I think I learned a lot from that experience.